All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is labor unions, okay? So, working conditions, as I've already alluded to during this time, were pretty horrible. Okay, there were very few labor laws. Children were in factories, in mines even, okay, and dying by the hundreds every year. Workers faced long hours, 12 hours a day, in most cases, sometimes up to 16 hours a day, but 12 hours was common. And they had very low pay, $1 a day. So how would you like to work for 12 hours, really hard? We're not talking about office work or something like that. Hard labor, and you make $1 a day, okay? And they had very bad working conditions. Now the children would make a quarter a day. Foreigners like Asians, especially the Asian people, would make a quarter a day, okay? And sometimes other ethnic groups like the Irish or the Italians that the nativists didn't like would have to make a quarter a day. The working conditions were horrible. No safety laws, like I said, okay? Miserable lighting and ventilation. No such thing as mass air conditioning, y'all. This is just air conditioning. It exists at this time, but it's very uncommon. It's kind of like a trinket, just something that just got invented, and it's not widespread yet, especially since electricity is not truly widespread yet at this time. All right. Few safety laws. Industrial accidents were very common. Okay. No workman's compensation. So if you got hurt on the job, you got fired. That's basically what it boils down to. Workman's compensation today means that if you get hurt on the job, your job has to pay for your recovery while you are sick or while you are injured to a certain point. Okay, so we have some pictures right here. Now look how young the youngest ones are. I think the age was 6. You could work after the age of 6. But after that, there was no regulations about how many hours they could work you or what kind of jobs you could have. So right here, they're peeling crab. Okay, this is somewhere probably in New England in the Northeast part of our country. This young man right here is a chimney sweep. Okay, so before you light a fire at a fireplace, you need to make sure that the chimney is not full of ashes, because if all those ashes and burnt up soot falls into the fire, it could cause a really, really bad fire. So every once in a while, you have to clean your chimney out. Well, they would pick young little boys that could fit in the chimney, and they would climb up on top of the roof, and they would start at the top. You always want to start at the top, because if you start at the bottom while you're cleaning with the brush, all the soot and nasty stuff's going to be falling all over you, and you're going to be breathing it in. So they would brace themselves at the top and start, and they would, swirl the brush around from the top down, and they would put a bag at the bottom to collect all the soot so they could throw it out after it's all done. A lot of times these young men were not fed well, okay? Because if you get too big or too fat, well, you got fired because you couldn't fit in the chimney anymore. So a lot of these guys they would pick the smallest boys, the skinniest boys, and the day you got stuck is the day you get fired, okay? So another situation, we have young men in the Appalachian Mountains right here. This is probably somewhere around Tennessee or North Carolina, Pennsylvania, in the coal mines, West Virginia as well. And look how young they are. Okay, look at this guy. He's probably what, 12 years old, maybe 10. Okay, and a miner back then was a horrible job because not only did you have cave-ins, but you also had, earthquakes. You had lack of air, sometimes poisonous air that would come in. You had explosions from the dynamite that they would blast through the mountain with in order to collect your coal. So most of these were coal miners right here, but there's also other kind of mines like, iron mines and, stuff like that. All right, corporate managers cared about production. So if you're the boss, you care about producing so you could get a profit. That's what they cared about. Workers were fired at a moment's notice and with no cause. So you could he could just not like the way you look. Hey, you're fired today. I don't like the way you looked at me. And you could not sue them. There was no workers' rights or anything like that. All right, standard of living increased. Even though these things are horrible that we're talking about, these workers' issues, because of the factories and the industrialization and America becoming this industrial giant that we were, we produced more goods than the entire rest of the world, okay, at certain points. So because of that, the faster you can produce an object, the cheaper it is generally, okay? The more you have of something, the cheaper it is. That's inflation, right, with money. But it worked with goods too, okay? So, I mean, if I make chairs by hand, okay? Actually, you know what? Scratch that. Think about toothpicks, okay? Toothpicks, that's my example. How much money would it take someone to pay you to get a little sliver of wood and a knife and carve out a toothpick? That would probably take you over an hour to carve out a toothpick, okay, if you had a block of wood and a knife. However, nowadays with mechanization and Eli Whitney making interchangeable parts and all these new factory machines, they could basically take a 2x4, run it through this grinder thing, and come out with 10,000 toothpicks on the other side. And because it's made cheaply and quickly and efficiently, then they can charge you, instead of, $5 a toothpick, now it's $1 for a box of 500 toothpicks. Okay, you understand the difference there. So because of mechanization, our standard of living went up, because as prices come down through mechanization, we can buy more with our dollar, and that means we get more stuff, and that makes your standard of living go up. Labor unions were created so workers could use collective bargaining to get better conditions. Okay, so again, a labor union, y'all, you should have remembered this from our basic U.S. history vocabulary. A labor union is whenever a group of workers get together and band together in order to get something from the boss, whether that's more pay, which is usually the case, better working conditions, safer working conditions, less hours, that kind of stuff. That is why labor unions are formed. Collective bargaining means simply the more people you have, the more powerful your labor union is. If one person goes and tells the boss, I want a raise or I quit, well, the boss is going to say, bye, right? However, if all the people at the factory go in and say, we quit unless we get a raise, well, now the owner of the factory, the robber baron, has a choice to make. Do I shut down my factory, fire all these people and get new workers and have to train them all? Or do I give them a little tiny pay raise? Okay, so that's why labor unions were created. Okay, unions were seen as a threat to business because of their greater negotiating strength through collective bargaining. So, like I said, one worker is not a threat. All the workers, big threat. Okay. All right. Some of our first national labor union in America was called the National Labor Union. Okay. But one of the other ones, called the Knights of Labor, this is a later labor union, used a process called arbitration, which is something the Knights of Labor didn't really do. Okay. Not effectively anyway. Arbitration means when two people are arguing, you get a neutral third party, someone who has nothing to do with the arrangement, to come in and settle the dispute. Okay? Both sides, the robber baron and the union, had to sign papers saying that whatever the arbiter said is going to be what they follow. So they were legally bound by the decision after that. Okay? The Knights of Labor treated all workers the same, regardless of race or skill level. This is something that the National Labor Union failed to do. Okay, the National Labor Union didn't let black people in. They didn't let Chinese people in. And also, one of the other big failings of the Knights of Labor is that basically they said unless you have a skill, unless you are a carpenter or an electrician, if you don't know anything, you can't join the union. Okay, so it made it harder. But the Knights of Labor said, we're going to take anybody. We're going to take black people. We're going to take Asian people. We're going to take people that are just starting out. And when you join a union, you have to actually pay dues or a membership fee to that union. So this is what made the Knights of Labor way more successful, is that their union membership went from 200,000 for the National Labor Union to 5 million for the Knights of Labor or something like that. Okay, I don't know the exact numbers, but because they accepted all people, that's how it worked. Okay. All right. Unions held meetings in secret because their activity was illegal because of the Sherman Antitrust Act. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have talked about the Sherman Antitrust Act before, the Anti-Monopoly Act, if you will. Just to refresh your memory, okay, back in 1890, they passed the Sherman Antitrust Act to try to get rid of the trust companies, the robber barons' monopolies. And for the first 10 years of this law's existence, it was worthless. The Supreme Court was actually paid off to do two things. One, the Supreme Court said that it was okay for the robber barons to rearrange their organizations, their trust companies, and call them holding companies, which basically acted the same as a trust company or a holding company, or a monopoly, I should say. The other thing they were paid off to do is say that because of the way the Sherman Antitrust Act was written, it actually didn't apply to trust companies at all. It applied to labor unions. Now, I know that sounds silly because it says Antitrust Act, right? But what was going on is the language in the Sherman Antitrust Act says you cannot do anything, you cannot organize to affect business. Well, do trust companies organize to affect business? Yeah, they create monopolies. Well, how about labor unions? Do they organize to affect business? Yes. Okay? They're going to organize into a collective group to try to affect the business. So therefore, the Sherman Antitrust Act, for the first 10 years of its life, was used against unions and not against the robber barons. Okay? Unions were nativists since immigrants provided employees with abundant, cheap labor. All right, again, if a Chinese guy will work for a quarter a day and a white guy will work for $1 a day, well, if the white guy wants a job, he's going to have to lower his cost. He's going to have to work for a quarter a day. And because the immigrants that are coming in are stealing nativist jobs and driving wages down by cheap labor, the nativists were naturally going to gravitate towards the unions. All unions are nativists. Okay? One of the big labor unions was Eugene Debs. Okay? Eugene Debs is this guy right here. He ran for president 4 times. The third time he ran for president, it was against Woodrow Wilson, and Woodrow Wilson actually put him in jail for 2 years, and he actually ran his campaign from the jail cell. Okay? He lost all 4 times. We did not have a president, Eugene Debs. But he believed that socialism, okay, he's a socialist. That means he thinks the government should take care of the people. Government should tax you in a high rate, but the government should also control the most important things in the economy. So he believed in socialism and that it would take power from the robber barons. And Debs wanted the government to nationalize America's large corporations. So Eugene Debs says, hey, these robber barons are out of control. Let's socialize, okay, or nationalize, which means the government comes in and just steals your stuff. In other words, John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil, it belongs to the government. Carnegie Steel belongs to the government now. The government just comes in and steals your stuff. Okay? So that's candidate Eugene Debs for you.